Mom, if we don't go back home today, will we starve? The whisper was tiny, muffled by the collar of a worn coat. The mother didn't answer, her fingers tightening around a park bench as the fog rolled in. Then came the second blow, sharper than the winter wind. But if we do go back, will Daddy hit you again? 20 feet away, a shadow stopped moving. The park was a graveyard of bare trees and rusted swings, swallowed by a gray October mist that made everything feel distant and unreal. Alolan Hart sat on a central bench, her posture a jagged line of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Her face, once beautiful, was a map of recent trauma, dark purple swells under her eyes and a jagged cut across her cheek that hummed with every pulse. Leora and Alara clung to her like small, frightened vines, their wide eyes searching a mother who no longer had answers, only bruises. Behind them, emerging from the fog like a predatory ghost, was Silas Thorne. He was a man of expensive wool coats and cold, calculated violence. He had come to this park to meet an informant, but he found something far more dangerous to his cold heart, a reflection of the boy he used to be, watching his own mother break under the weight of a monster. The silence in the master bedroom had always been a weapon, but that night, it felt like a guillotine. Alolan stood by the mahogany dresser, her breath shallow, watching the reflection of her husband in the darkened windowpane. Julian Vane didn't look like a monster, he looked like a man of industry, his cufflinks gleaming under the dim lamp, his movements precise and cold. For 10 years, Alolan had lived within the architecture of control he had built around her, a world where the walls were thick, the bank accounts were hidden, and her voice was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had endured the isolation and the accidental bruises for a decade, convinced that as long as the violence stayed between the two of them, her daughters were safe. That was the unwritten pact, her own silent vow of the skin. But an hour ago, that vow had been incinerated. She could still hear the echoes of Leora's muffled cry from the hallway. Julian had lost his patience, not with Alolan, but with a 7-year-old who had accidentally spilled a glass of water near his blueprints. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was the way he had gripped Leora's arm, the look of predatory coldness in his eyes that signaled a new, terrifying threshold had been crossed. The beast was no longer satisfied with one victim. Julian turned away from the window, his gaze landing on Alolan. "You're being quiet tonight, Elle," he said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "That's good. It saves us both the trouble of an argument." He didn't see the fire behind her tired eyes. He didn't see that for the first time in 10 years, Alolan Hart wasn't afraid of him, she was afraid for them. "I'm going to check on the girls," she whispered, her voice steady enough to deceive him. "Don't," Julian commanded, stepping toward the bed. "They need to learn. Discipline is the only thing that keeps this family standing." He retreated into the inside bathroom, the sound of the shower starting a signal of a temporary reprieve. Alolan didn't go to the girls. Not yet. She knew she had less than 5 minutes. She moved to the floorboards beneath the heavy velvet armchair, her fingers trembling as she pried up the loose wood. Hidden there was the only thing Julian valued more than his family, the Black Ledger. It was a small, leather-bound book filled with the encrypted logistics of the Hartvane shipping empire. To Julian, it was a record of power. To Alolan, who had spent years silently proofreading his business correspondence under the guise of a dutiful wife, it was a map of every illegal port, every bribed official, and every weakness in his fortress. She tucked the cold leather against her ribs, beneath her coat, and moved toward the children's room. Leora and Alara were already awake, huddled together in a single bed, their eyes wide as they saw their mother's bruised face illuminated by a night light. "Don't put on your shoes," Alolan breathed, her heart hammering against the ledger. "Just your coats. We're going on a secret walk." "Is Daddy coming?" Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Alolan said, her voice turning to iron. "Daddy is never coming again." The shower was still running when they reached the hallway window at the end of the corridor. It was a second-story drop into the overgrown hydrangea bushes below. The winter air was already screaming through the cracks in the frame. Alolan looked at the drop, then at her daughters. The height was terrifying, but the silence coming from the master bedroom was worse. She lowered Leora first, hanging by her arms until the girl's feet touched the soft, frozen earth. Then Alara, who clung to her neck until the very last second. Finally, Aloan climbed onto the ledge. She looked back once at the house that had been her prison, the ledger heavy against her heart. As the bathroom door clicked open down the hall, Aloan let go. The impact was a shock of ice and pain that vibrated through her teeth, but she didn't stop to check for broken bones. She grabbed her daughter's hands and vanished into the fog, 3 shadows running away from a monster and toward a cold, hungry freedom. The fog didn't just drift, it crawled, a thick, suffocating gray that swallowed the rusted swing sets and the jagged skeletons of the winter oaks. Aloan sat perfectly still, her heart a frantic, trapped bird against the cold leather of the ledger tucked beneath her coat. Every breath was a gamble, the icy air stinging the fresh cuts on her face. Leora and Alara were shivering against her sides, their small bodies radiating a heat that was fast failing against the October wind. She had heard the footsteps minutes ago, the heavy, rhythmic tread of someone who didn't care about being heard. To a woman who had spent a decade memorizing the sound of a monster's gate, these footsteps were different. They didn't have Julian's erratic, sharp-edged impatience. They were steady. Calculated. Like a landslide that had decided exactly where it was going to fall. A shadow materialized through the mist, taller and broader than any nightmare Aloan had conjured. Silas Thorne didn't stop until he was exactly 6 feet away, a distance that felt both like a mercy and a threat. He was dressed in a charcoal wool coat that looked like it cost more than the car Aloan had abandoned. His face was a landscape of hard angles and eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of the world and decided to stay there. Aloan's grip on her daughters tightened. She waited for the cold steel of a barrel, for the familiar bark of a command, for the end of her 9-day flight. "He's coming for you," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the fog like a blade. It didn't carry the heat of anger, it carried the weight of a fact. Julian Vane doesn't lose things. And he certainly doesn't lose things that can burn his ports to the ground. Aloan's throat felt like it was filled with glass. "I don't know who you are." "You know who I am," Silas countered, his gaze drifting for a fraction of a second to the girls' mismatched sweaters and then back to the purple bruise blooming on Aloan's forehead. "I'm the man who's been trying to dismantle your husband's shipping routes for 3 years. And you're the woman who just did it in one night." He didn't move toward her, but the air between them seemed to vibrate. Silas reached into his pocket. Aloan flinched, her eyes snapping shut, but the sound that followed wasn't a click, it was the rustle of heavy fabric. When she opened her eyes, he was holding out a second coat, a dark, thick shearling he had been carrying over his arm. "Your youngest is turning blue," he remarked, his voice devoid of pity, replaced instead by a grim, focused pragmatism. "And the fog is hiding your scent for now, but the dogs will be here by dawn. Julian has already put a price on that book you're clutching." He stepped one pace closer, and for the first time, the predatory mask flickered. He saw the way Leora was looking at him, wide-eyed, terrified, yet searching for a shred of something that wasn't violence. It was a look Silas Thorne hadn't seen in a mirror for 20 years. "I'm not a good man, Aloan." "Let's not pretend otherwise," he said, holding the coat out further. "But I am an ambitious one. I can give you a deadbolt Julian can't break. I can give those girls a room where the windows don't rattle when someone shouts. In exchange, you give me the logistics. You give me the map to the Heartvane Empire." He waited, the silence of the park stretching thin as a wire. "You have 2 paths," Silas whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt like a lifeline. "You can stay here and freeze, waiting for the man who gave you those bruises to find you. Or you can come with me and learn how to fight." Leora looked up at her mother, her small hand trembling against Aloan's arm. The fog seemed to press closer, the shadows of the 2 men in the distance, Silas's enforcers, shifting like ghosts. Aloan looked at the coat, then at the man who had built his reputation on fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing the expensive wool. The warmth was immediate, a shocking contrast to the ice in her soul. She stood up, her legs nearly buckling, and pulled her daughters into the circle of Silas Thorne's shadow. Teach me, she breathed. Silas didn't smile, but he inclined his head, a king acknowledging a new, dangerous ally. Then let's go. We have a world to burn. The safe house was a cathedral of concrete and shadow, tucked away behind a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. Inside, the air didn't bite like the park, but it carried the sterile, heavy scent of gun oil and old paper. Silas moved through the space with a predatory grace, flicking a single switch that bathed the kitchen in a low, amber glow. He didn't offer comfort, he offered bread, cheese, and a thermos of soup that looked like it had been salvaged from a soldier's kit. Eloan sat at the small metal table, her daughters flanking her like two bookends of fragile glass. Leora and Alara ate with a frantic, silent intensity that made Silas's jaw tighten. They didn't talk. They didn't complain about the hardness of the crust or the lack of salt. They simply consumed, their eyes darting to the corners of the room every time the building groaned under the weight of the wind. It was the hunger of the hunted, a rhythm Silas recognized from a life he had tried to bury under piles of silk and blood. Silas stood by the counter, his charcoal coat tossed over a chair, revealing the holstered weight at his hip. He wasn't looking at the children. He was looking at Eloan. She wasn't eating. Instead, she had placed the black ledger on the table, her bruised fingers tracing the embossed leather as if it were a talisman. Eat, Silas commanded, his voice a low vibration in the small room. A starving mind makes mistakes, and Julian doesn't forgive mistakes. Eloan looked up, her tired eyes catching the light. I'm not hungry. I'm thinking. About what? Where to run next? About Pier 47, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it rang through the kitchen like a bell. Silas froze, his hand halfway to a glass of water. Pier 47 was a ghost in the shipping world, a dead zone on the maps that his own informants had insisted was nothing more than a scrapyard for rusted hulls. Pier 47 is a graveyard, Eloan. My people have scouted it for months. It's empty. Eloan finally opened the ledger, but she didn't look at the pages. She looked at the wall, her mind clearly projecting a different reality. It's empty on the surface. That's why you missed it. Julian doesn't use the cranes. He uses the ballast water systems. He's been moving liquid assets, literally, through the old fire suppression pipes that run under the pier. Every Tuesday, the pressure gauges at the municipal station dip for exactly 6 minutes. That's not a leak, Silas. That's the syndicate's heart beating. Silas walked to the table, his shadow looming over the ledger. He looked at the bruised woman he had pulled from a park bench, and for the first time, he didn't see a victim. He saw a threat. He saw the woman who had lived in the silence of Julian Vane's house and spent that time listening to the pipes hum and the ledgers breathe. You didn't just proofread his mail, Silas realized, his voice dropping to a dangerous, appreciative depth. You mapped the mechanics of his soul. I had to know where the exits were, Eloan replied, her gaze finally meeting his. I spent 10 years memorizing the anatomy of that empire so I could find the one place to cut it that would make him bleed out. Pier 47 isn't just a port. It's the filter. Every cent of laundered money from the Northern Territory passes through those fire pipes. Leora looked up from her soup, sensing the shift in the room's temperature. Mommy? Is the bad man coming here? Eloan reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she smoothed Leora's hair, but her eyes remained locked on Silas. No, baby. We're the ones who are going to do the finding now. Silas reached into his vest and pulled out a burner phone, his fingers flying across the keys. He didn't look away from Eloan. He saw the way she looked at the book, not with fear, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a general. Julian Vane thought he had lost a wife. He hadn't realized he had released his most lethal architect into the hands of his greatest enemy. Get some sleep, Silas said, and this time, it was almost a request. Tomorrow, we stop running. Tomorrow, you show me exactly how to break that heart. The predator didn't need a map to find what belonged to him, he used the scent of fear and the digital breadcrumbs of a city he owned. Julian Vane stood in the center of the park where Eloan had sat only hours before, his polished shoes pressing into the damp gold clusters of fallen leaves. He didn't look like a grieving husband. He looked like a hunter who had just found a fresh trail. Behind him, 3 men stood like statues in the fog, their radios crackling with the low hum of syndicate chatter. Julian closed his eyes, visualizing the geometry of the city, the shipping routes, the dead zones, and the few men powerful enough to hide a woman holding a ledger that could end them all. Thorn, Julian whispered, the name a curse that tasted like copper. He knew the safehouse locations. He knew the gray zones where Silas operated. He tapped his phone, and 1,000 eyes across the city began to blink open. Inside the warehouse safehouse, the air suddenly changed. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in the atmospheric pressure, the subtle kill switch of a silent alarm that only Silas could feel. He was on his feet before the first black SUV rounded the corner 3 blocks away. He didn't waste time with explanations. He crossed the room in 2 strides, scooping Alara into one arm while his other hand gripped Alohan's shoulder. "They're here," Silas breathed, his voice a jagged edge of urgency. "The perimeter's been tripped." Julian didn't wait for dawn. Alohan's heart didn't just race, it slammed against her ribs like a captive bird. She didn't ask how. She knew the reach of the Vane Syndicate. She grabbed Leora's hand, the girl's fingers ice-cold and trembling, and followed Silas into the bowels of the warehouse. They didn't go for the front exit or the loading docks. Instead, Silas kicked aside a heavy iron grate hidden beneath a stack of rusted pallets, revealing a yawning throat of darkness that smelled of damp earth and ancient soot. "The old Atlantic line," Silas said, guiding them down a rusted ladder. "It hasn't seen a train in 40 years, but the tunnels still breathe." They descended into a world of dripping pipes and echoes. Above them, the muffled sound of heavy boots shattered the warehouse windows. The hunters had arrived. Alohan looked up one last time, seeing the flickering light of tactical flashlights dancing across the ceiling like ghost fire. She felt the heavy weight of the ledger against her chest, a reminder that they weren't just running for their lives, they were running with a bomb. The tunnel was a narrow, claustrophobic vein of brick and shadow. Silas moved with the certainty of a man who had memorized the city's underside, his flashlight a narrow spear of light that cut through the absolute black. They moved in a rhythmic, desperate silence, the only sound the splashing of their feet in shallow, stagnant water. Leora tripped over a protruding rail, a small sob escaping her throat, and Alohan caught her, pulling her close. "Don't look back, Leora," Alohan whispered, her own voice cracking. "Just look at the light." Behind them, the sound of the iron grate being ripped open echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot. The scent of blood was literal now, the metallic tang of Julian's enforcers entering the darkness. Silas stopped at a junction where 3 tunnels met, his head tilted, listening to the vibration of the brickwork. "They have dogs," Silas muttered, his jaw tightening. "The ventilation shafts will carry the scent straight to them. We need to go deeper." He shoved a heavy rusted door to their left, leading them into a secondary maintenance crawlspace that felt like the lungs of the city. The ceiling was so low that Alohan had to hunch over, her bruised face stinging as she brushed against the rough, weeping stone. They crawled through the dark for what felt like miles, the sound of the pursuit growing faint, then sharp, then fading again as the labyrinth swallowed them. When they finally emerged into a larger chamber, the air was different, fresher, smelling of salt and the river. Silas killed his light. They stood in the heavy, velvet dark, listening to the distant drip of water. Far above them, the city hummed with a life that seemed a world away. They had escaped the initial net, but as Alohan felt the dampness of the tunnel walls, she realized the hunt wasn't over. Julian hadn't just tracked her scent, he had mapped her fear. And in the silence of the tunnels, she realized that to survive, she would have to stop being the prey and start being the architect of Julian's ruin. The secondary safe house was a converted clock tower on the city's northern edge, a place where the air felt thin and the ticking of 1,000 brass gears hummed like a heartbeat in the walls. Silas Thorne didn't offer Alohan a bed this time, he offered her a desk. It was a heavy slab of oak positioned under a skylight that allowed the pale, cold moonlight to wash over the black ledger. Leora and Alara were asleep in the adjoining room, tucked under blankets that finally smelled of cedar rather than damp concrete. For the first time in 10 years, Eloane was alone with her thoughts and the man who saw her as a variable in a war, rather than a trophy in a cage. Silas stood by the window, his silhouette a sharp, unyielding line against the glass. He held a small, black semi-automatic pistol in his hand, the metal gleaming dully. Without looking back, he placed it on the corner of Eloane's desk with a heavy thud. "That is what Julian uses to keep you quiet," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "It's loud. It's clumsy. It requires you to be in the same room as your enemy to be effective." Eloane looked at the weapon, her breath hitching. The mere sight of it brought back the sound of Julian's safe being clicked open, the metallic slide that signaled a night of terror. She moved her hand away, her fingers brushing the leather of the ledger instead. "I don't want it," she whispered. "Good," Silas replied, turning to face her. He stepped into the light, his eyes tracking the way she flinched, then settled. "Because that book is 1,000 times more lethal. Julian thinks you stole his money. He thinks you stole his secrets. He doesn't realize you stole his spine." He leaned over the desk, his large hands framing the ledger. "A bullet can only kill a man once, Eloane. But information? Information can erase him. It can turn his allies into his executioners. It can make his name so toxic that even the earth won't want his body." He tapped a finger on a series of encrypted dates and alphanumeric strings she had transcribed earlier. "Julian built his empire on logistics. You're going to rebuild yourself on the same foundation. Stop seeing these as numbers. See them as a sequence of failures. Tell me what you see in the third quarter of last year." Eloane took a deep breath, forcing herself to look past the ink and into the memory of the nights she had spent organizing Julian's files while he slept off a bottle of scotch. She began to see the patterns, the way certain vessels drifted off course for exactly 3 hours near the coast of Maine, the way the fuel costs spiked in months where there was no recorded increase in cargo. "He wasn't moving goods," Eloane murmured, her voice gaining a cold, analytical edge. "He was moving people. These aren't shipping routes, Silas. They're a schedule for the syndicate's high-level summits. He's been hosting the families on his tankers because he knew the Coast Guard wouldn't board a registered vein vessel." Silas watched her, his expression unreadable, but a slow, dangerous spark ignited in his eyes. He saw the way her shoulders squared, the way the victim in her posture began to dissolve into the architect. "Go on," Silas urged. "If I cross-reference these fuel spikes with the municipal dip at Pier 47, Eloane continued, her fingers flying across a fresh sheet of paper, I can tell you exactly which tanker is carrying the syndicate's primary server tonight. He's moved the heart of his operations to the water because he thinks no one can touch him there." She looked up at Silas, the moonlight highlighting the bruise on her cheek, a mark that no longer looked like a sign of defeat, but a brand of war. "You want to fight him?" Eloane asked, her voice turning to iron. "Then stop looking for him in the city. He's at sea, and I just found the coordinates to his flagship." Silas reached out, not to touch her, but to take the paper she had filled with calculations. He looked at the numbers, then back at her. "He spent 10 years trying to break you, Eloane. He should have spent that time wondering why he was letting the smartest person in the room watch him sleep." He took the pistol from the desk and tucked it back into his holster. "Keep decoding. By dawn, I want the name of every man on that ship. We aren't just going to find him. We're going to make sure he has nowhere to land." The ticking of the clock tower gears was no longer a heartbeat, it was a countdown. Eloane stared at the burner phone vibrating on the oak desk, its screen a jagged star of blue light in the gloom. The message was a single, grainy image, her younger sister, Clara, sitting in a chair Eloane recognized too well, the one in Julian's private study, where the shadows always seemed to lean in. There was no text, no list of demands. With Julian, the threat was always in what he didn't say. Eloane felt the phantom sting of a hand she hadn't felt in days. The rebuilding Silas had started, the cold logic, the tactical decoding, the hardening of her spirit, threatened to dissolve back into the salt and ash of her old life. Julian wasn't hunting her in the shipping lanes anymore. He had gone for the marrow. He has her, Aloan whispered, the words catching in a throat that felt like it was lined with rusted wire. Silas was across the room, cleaning a glass with a slow, methodical rhythm that didn't falter. He didn't look at the phone. I know. My people saw them take her from the florist shop at 4:10 p.m. They were efficient. Aloan spun around, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp betrayal. You knew? You knew and you didn't tell me? You let him take her? Silas set the glass down. The amber light of the clock tower caught the scars on his knuckles. I let him commit. Julian is a man of habit, Aloan. He thinks this is a hostage exchange. He thinks he's pulled you back onto his board where the rules are simple, your blood for his ledger. If I had stopped the kidnapping, he would have vanished into the fog and waited for a better opening. Now, he's anchored. He's exactly where we need him to be. He's going to kill her. Aloan's voice rose, a jagged cry that made Leora stir in the next room. She grabbed the ledger, clutching it to her chest as if it could shield her sister. I have to go back. I'll give him the book. I'll tell him I forced Silas to take us. I'll make him believe it. Silas moved then, not with anger, but with the terrifying speed of a landslide. He was in her space before she could blink, his large hand closing over hers on the desk, pinning the ledger down. Look at me, he commanded. His eyes weren't cold, they were furnaces of hard-won wisdom. If you go back now, you aren't saving Clara. You're just giving him a larger audience for the execution. He doesn't want the ledger back, Aloan. He wants the woman who was smart enough to steal it to be erased. He'll kill Clara to punish you, and then he'll kill you to prove he can. Then what do I do? She sobbed, the learned helplessness of a decade fighting to pull her under. He's my brother-in-law. He's the father of my children. He knows exactly how to break me. He knows how to break the woman you were, Silas countered, his voice dropping to a low, hypnotic iron. He has no idea who is sitting in this chair tonight. You have the coordinates to his server. You have the names of his silent partners. You don't trade the ledger, Aloan. You use it to take away the only thing that makes him feel safe. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voice memo. Aloan's thumb hovered over the play button, her breath hitching. She looked at Silas, seeing the choice reflected in his unyielding gaze. It was the ultimate crossroads, the path of the victim, paved with the familiar terror of the past, or the path of the architect, which required her to trust a man who traded in blood. Trust the logic, Aloan, Silas whispered. Don't trust the fear. The fear is his voice in your head. The logic is yours. Aloan looked down at the ledger. She saw the fuel spikes, the municipal dips, the patterns of a monster's greed. She realized that Julian hadn't just taken her sister, he had exposed his flank. He had come out of the sea and into the city, thinking he was the hunter. She didn't play the voice memo. Instead, she picked up the pen. Tell your men to get the cars, Aloan said, her voice finally turning to glass, clear, sharp, and capable of cutting. We aren't going to the exchange. We're going to his server room. If he wants a trade, he can trade his entire empire for my sister's life. And even then, I might not give it back. Silas watched her, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. The student was gone. The architect had arrived. The Central Public Library was a labyrinth of marble and hushed echoes, a place where sound went to die among millions of pages. It was the last place Julian Vane would expect a violent confrontation, which was exactly why Aloan had chosen it. She sat at a heavy oak table in the reference section, the air smelling of old paper and floor wax. Leora and Alara were miles away, guarded by Silas's best men in a room with no windows, but Aloan could still feel the phantom weight of their hands in hers. She didn't look up when the chair across from her slid back. The scent of Julian's expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold rain, hit her before he even spoke. You look different, Elle, Julian whispered. His voice was a serrated edge, smoothed over by the forced civility of the room. The park didn't suit you. You were always meant for finer things. Eloan slowly lifted her gaze. Julian was dressed in a charcoal suit, his posture perfect, his hands folded neatly on the table. To any casual observer, they were just a handsome couple discussing a book. But Eloan saw the way his eyes darted to the black leather portfolio she had placed between them. She saw the minute tremor in his jaw. For 10 years, she had mistaken his control for strength and his obsession for love. Now, through the lens Silas had provided, she saw the truth. "Clara is safe, Julian," she said, her voice so low it barely stirred the dust motes in the air. "Silas's men extracted her 10 minutes ago. Your enforcers at the flower shop weren't as loyal as you thought. It's amazing what men will trade for a clean slate." Julian's face didn't break, but his eyes turned into chips of flint. "You think Thorne can protect you?" "He's a scavenger, Eloan. He's using you to get to my routes. When he's done, he'll discard you just like everything else he touches." "He isn't the one I'm worried about," Eloan replied. She leaned forward, just an inch, mirroring the way Julian used to loom over her in the kitchen. "I used to think you hit me because you were angry. I thought you controlled me because you loved me too much to let me go. But looking at you now, in this quiet room, I realize I was wrong." She tapped the portfolio. "You aren't angry, Julian. You're terrified. You never loved me. You were just keeping your most dangerous witness in a cage. You knew that if I ever looked at those ledgers with my eyes open instead of downcast, I'd see exactly how hollow your empire really is." Julian reached across the table, his hand stopping just inches from hers. The predatory mask slipped for a heartbeat, revealing a raw, jagged desperation. "Give me the book, Eloan. We can go back. I'll forget the last 2 weeks. I'll let you have the West Wing. Just, give it to me." "You aren't asking for your wife back," she said, a cold, crystalline realization settling in her chest. "You're asking for your immunity. You know that if the syndicate finds out I have the digital keys to the server on Pier 47, they won't blame Silas. They'll blame you for being weak enough to let a clumsy wife see the blueprints." The silence between them grew heavy, a physical weight that made the vast library feel like a tomb. Julian's hand retreated, clenching into a fist. He looked around the room, at the students, the librarians, the security guards, and realized he was trapped in a cage of his own making. He couldn't scream, he couldn't strike her, and he couldn't leave without the one thing that could save him from his own masters. "You've become a very dangerous woman, Eloan," he hissed, the threat finally bare. "No," she corrected him, standing up and tucking the portfolio under her arm. "I was always dangerous. You were just too arrogant to notice." As she walked away, weaving through the tall stacks of books, she didn't look back. She could feel Julian's gaze burning into her spine, but for the first time in a decade, the heat didn't make her flinch. The trap was set, and Julian Vane had just walked straight into the center of it. The sirens hadn't even begun to wail before the first concussion grenade shattered the glass in the grand foyer. The air in Thorne Manor, usually thick with the scent of beeswax and old leather, was suddenly replaced by the acrid, biting sting of magnesium and smoke. Silas was a shadow in motion, his weapon drawn before the echoes had died. He didn't look back at Eloan, he knew she was already moving toward the daughters who had become his shadow as much as hers. "Go. To the library." Silas roared over the sound of automatic fire chewing through the heavy oak doors. "They aren't here for the ledger anymore, Eloan. Julian has authorized a scorched earth protocol." The Vane Syndicate didn't knock, they dismantled. Black-clad figures moved through the garden like ink in water, their thermal sights sweeping the windows. Eloan grabbed Leora and Alara, her heart a frantic hammer against her ribs. She didn't head for the basement or the reinforced panic room. She knew Julian's men would have the blueprints for those. Julian had likely studied them the moment he realized who Silas Thorne was. Instead, she dragged the girls toward the small, ornamental mahogany paneling in the servants' corridor. Her father, a man who had spent his life building the very architecture of control Julian now weaponized, had been the one to renovate this manor 40 years ago. He had left behind more than just walls, he had left a nervous system of hidden passages and ventilation shafts designed for discreet maintenance, and for a child who had once used them to hide from a father's heavy footsteps. In here, Eloane breathed, her fingers finding the recessed latch behind a carved lion's head. Don't make a sound. Remember the library game. We are ghosts. The girls scrambled into the narrow, dust-choked darkness of the internal vents. It was a world of galvanized steel and the humming vibration of the house's heating system. Eloane followed, the black ledger pressed hard against her chest. Above them, the ceiling groaned as enforcers breached the second floor. She could hear the rhythmic thwip-thwip of silenced rounds and the heavy, guttural commands of Julian's lead enforcer, a man who had once sat at her dinner table. The vents were narrow, the air tasting of rust and ancient insulation, but to Eloane, it was a survival map. She remembered her father's blueprints, not the ones he showed the clients, but the ones he kept in his study. This manor was built with a triple-lung ventilation system. If she could reach the central junction, she could lead the girls directly to the garage's sub-level, bypassing the killing zones Julian's men had established. Right at the junction, Leora, Eloane whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. Follow the blue light. Stay low. As they crawled, the house screamed around them. A grenade detonated in the kitchen, the shockwave vibrating through the steel ducts, rattling Alara's small frame. The girl let out a tiny, stifled whimper, and Eloane reached forward, her hand finding Alara's shaking shoulder. I've got you, Eloane murmured, her eyes burning with a sudden, lethal clarity. She realized then that Julian had made a fatal error. He thought he was hunting a woman in a house. He didn't realize he was hunting a woman inside a machine she understood better than the men who built it. She stopped at a grate overlooking the main hall. Below, she saw Julian himself. He stood among the wreckage of Silas's life, his charcoal coat dusted with plaster, looking like a king of ruins. He was looking at his watch, his face a mask of cold, ticking impatience. Check the vents. Julian shouted, his voice echoing up through the grate. She's like a rat. Smoke her out if you have to. Eloane didn't flinch. She watched the man who had broken her spirit for a decade, and she felt nothing but the weight of the metal she was currently standing on. She turned back to her daughters, pointing toward the vertical shaft that led to the silent, dark safety of the underground. She wasn't just escaping a house anymore. She was navigating the exit strategy of her entire life, and Julian Vane was still looking at the floorboards, never realizing the ceiling was about to collapse on him. The sublevel of the manor was a tomb of silence, the only sound the distant, muffled thud of Julian's frustration echoing through the concrete floor. Eloane sat on a rusted folding chair in the shadows of the garage, a single laptop screen casting a cold, flickering blue light over her face. Leora and Alara were huddled together in the back of Silas's armored SUV, finally safe behind 3 inches of reinforced steel, but Eloane's work wasn't finished. She wasn't just hiding anymore, she was dismantling. She didn't open a connection to the police or the federal bureaus. She knew the syndicate's reach, a call to the authorities would only give Julian a chance to intercept and bury the evidence with a well-placed bribe. Instead, Eloane opened a series of encrypted channels to the vultures, the rival cartels and shipping magnates who had spent years losing territory to the Vane syndicate. If she wanted to destroy Julian, she didn't need a judge. She needed a shark. You're sure about this? Silas asked, standing by the garage door with his weapon lowered. Once you push that button, there's no coming back. Julian won't just be an enemy, he'll be a liability to everyone he's ever worked for. I spent 10 years being a liability, Eloane replied, her voice as steady as the ticking clock tower gears. It's his turn. With a series of precise keystrokes, she began the blackout protocol. She didn't dump the whole ledger at once. She leaked it in surgical strikes. First, she sent the coordinates of the server flagship to the Caspian Group, the syndicate's primary competitor in the northern lanes. Within seconds, she saw the digital pings of a dozen rival intercepts. Julian's invisible fleet was suddenly glowing like a flare in a dark room. Next, she moved to the bow of the skin. She leaked the internal memos showing that Julian had been skimming off the top of the syndicate's central fund for years, hiding the surplus in offshore accounts under the name of a dead mistress. She sent these files directly to the syndicate's board of directors, men who valued loyalty only slightly less than they valued their margins. The digital destruction was silent and total. On her screen, Aloan watched as Julian's primary accounts were frozen by security alerts she had triggered. She watched as his encrypted communications channels went dark one by one, his allies cutting the cord the moment they realized the ship was sinking. In the space of 20 minutes, the man who had controlled every aspect of her life was stripped of his armor. He was no longer the high-ranking enforcer of a brutal empire, he was a man in a dusty hallway with an empty gun and no one to answer his radio. A final message blinked on her screen, a confirmation from the Pier 47 municipal station. The fire suppression pipes she had mapped out were being seized by a rival tactical team. The heart of Julian's money laundering operation had just been stopped. Aloan closed the laptop. The silence in the garage felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a cage, but the silence of a clear horizon. She looked at the bruised reflection of herself in the dark screen and saw a woman who had finally rewritten the blueprints of her own life. Above them, the sounds of the siege had changed. There were no more organized breaches, no more tactical commands. There was only the sound of men retreating, their footsteps frantic as they realized the man paying them was no longer a king. Julian Vane was alone in the wreckage of a house he thought he owned, while Aloan Hart walked toward the SUV, the heavy weight of the ledger finally replaced by the light of a morning that didn't belong to a monster. The transition from the cold, industrial sub-level to the quiet warmth of the west side happened in a blur of motion and heavy doors. The syndicate did not tolerate failures, and they certainly did not tolerate the man who had invited the wolves to their doorstep. By the time the sun began to rise over the city's skyline, Julian Vane was no longer a name that carried weight, he was a ghost, stripped of his assets and delivered to a place where walls were made of stone and iron, far from the mahogany and silk he had used to build his cage. The architecture of control had finally collapsed inward, leaving him in a silence he couldn't manipulate. Aloan stood on the balcony of the new apartment, the morning air crisp but no longer biting. It was a modest space, but it was hers. There were no hidden ledgers under the floorboards, no cameras in the corners, and no footsteps to track in the dead of night. Behind her, the living room was a soft landscape of cardboard boxes and the smell of fresh paint. Silas Thorne had fulfilled his part of the bargain, providing the deadbolt he had promised, a security system that didn't just lock doors, but guarded a new life. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. The bruises on her face had faded to pale yellow shadows, and the hypervigilance that had kept her shoulders hunched for a decade was beginning to melt away into a strange, heavy peace. She wasn't the woman who had leaped from a second-story window in the dark. She was the architect who had dismantled an empire to save her children. A soft tug at her sweater brought her back from the horizon. Alara stood there, her blonde pigtails slightly messy from sleep, clutching a small purple crayon in her hand. The girl looked out through the balcony railings at the quiet street below, where the winter light was turning the trees to silver. She looked at the door, then back at Aloan, her wide eyes still holding a fragment of the fear that had been their constant companion for so long. "Mommy?" Alara whispered, her voice small but clear in the morning silence. "Is the bad man still looking for us? Are we going back to the big house?" Aloan knelt, bringing herself level with her daughter. She looked past Alara into the living room, where Leora was already at work, carefully placing a sticker of a bright yellow sun on the doorframe. It wasn't a secret walk anymore. It wasn't a picnic at a gas station. Aloan reached out and took Alara's hand, feeling the warmth and the small, firm reality of it. For the first time in 10 years, the answer didn't feel like a lie designed to survive the next hour. It felt like the truth. "No, baby," Aloan said, her voice turning to iron and silk all at once. "We aren't going back. Not today, and not tomorrow." "But, where are we going?" Aloan smiled, a real, slow-blooming expression that reached her eyes and stayed there. She stood up, pulling Alara close to her side as they looked out at the city that no longer felt like a hunting ground. "We aren't going anywhere," Aloan breathed, the words carrying the weight of a 10-year war finally won. "We are already home." In the hallway, the deadbolt slid into its locked position with a solid, faithful click. It wasn't a sound of imprisonment. It was the sound of a promise kept. The architect had finished her masterpiece, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a weapon, it was peace. 6 months had passed, and the city's skyline no longer looked like a cage to Aloan heart, it looked like a blueprint. She stood in the glass-walled office of a high-rise that Julian Vane had never been important enough to enter. The winter fog had long since surrendered to the sharp, clear light of early spring. On her desk sat a single, leather-bound book, not the original black ledger, but a new one, filled with her own notations and a strategy that had shifted the power balance of the entire eastern seaboard. The vultures she had contacted during the siege were now her partners, though they were beginning to realize that Aloan didn't just understand the shipping routes, she controlled the rhythm of the tide. Silas Thorne leaned against the doorframe, his silhouette as steady as the day he had found her on the park bench. He didn't look at the city, he looked at the woman who had transformed from a ghost in a hallway to the architect of a new order. "The syndicate tried to move through Pier 47 last night," Silas said, his voice a low, familiar vibration. "They found the fire pipes welded shut. Julian's old masters are looking for a new enforcer. They're offering a seat at the table." Aloan didn't turn around. She watched a cargo ship glide silently into the harbor below, knowing exactly what it carried and where it would land. Julian was in a cell in a maximum security wing, a man who had built a life on control and ended up in a room with no handle on the door. He was a footnote in the story he thought he owned. "Tell them I'm not interested in a seat," Aloan replied, her voice crystalline and cold. "I'm the one who designed the table. If they want to sit at it, they'll have to pay the rent." She picked up a small, framed photo from her desk, Leora and Alara, standing in a garden of blooming hydrangeas, their smiles wide and their eyes free of the shadows that had once lived there. They were at a school Julian could never find, in a house he could never touch. "You've become exactly what you feared, Aloan," Silas remarked, though there was a rare, jagged edge of respect in his tone. "A woman who knows where all the bodies are buried." "No," Aloan corrected, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and entirely at peace. "I'm the woman who made sure they stayed buried so my daughters could walk on solid ground." She walked to the window and placed her hand against the glass. The city hummed beneath her touch, a massive, complex machine that finally worked for her. The architect wasn't just surviving anymore. She was reigning. Sometimes the hardest battle a person fights is not against an enemy, but against the fear that has lived inside them for years. Aloan spent a decade believing silence would keep her children safe, believing endurance was the same as love. But the moment she realized that fear had begun to reach her daughters, something inside her changed. She chose the terrifying road of freedom over the familiar prison of survival. This story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the moment a person decides that protecting the people they love matters more than the pain they might face. True strength often awakens in the quietest souls when they finally understand their worth. Abusers build cages with control, intimidation, and silence, but those cages collapse the moment truth and courage step into the light. When one person dares to break the cycle of fear, they don't just save themselves, they create a future where the next generation can grow up without chains. Before you leave today, here is something truly important I hope you remember. Take care of your mind the same way you take care of your body. Many people push through exhaustion, stress, and emotional pain without realizing that the mind also needs rest, healing, and kindness. When life becomes overwhelming, pause for a moment. Breathe deeply. Step away from constant noise, pressure, and negativity. Even a few minutes of quiet reflection, fresh air, or a short walk can reset your thoughts and protect your mental well-being. Your health is not only about what you eat or how much you exercise, it is also about how you treat yourself emotionally. Give yourself permission to rest. Speak kindly to yourself. Let go of burdens that were never yours to carry alone. A healthy mind creates a stronger life, clearer decisions, and deeper happiness. No matter how busy life becomes, never forget that protecting your peace is one of the most powerful forms of self-care you can practice. To everyone who took the time to listen to this story, thank you. Truly. Stories like this are not just about drama or suspense, they are about the quiet strength people carry inside them, even when the world feels unbearably heavy. If this story touched you, moved you, or made you pause for a moment and feel something deeper, then it has already done what it was meant to do. Your presence here means more than you might realize. Every view, every comment, and every moment you spend with these stories helps keep this space alive, a place where powerful human experiences can be shared, felt, and remembered. If you enjoy stories that explore courage, resilience, and the hidden strength of the human spirit, I promise there are many more waiting for you here. Each one carries a new journey, a new struggle, and a new reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can still rise. So stay close. There are many more stories yet to be told, and I would be honored to share them with you.